Hello, everyone, and welcome to the official launch event for Amplify, the Sound of Banking and FinTech. My name is Barbara, and I am the social media manager here at AMP. And for the fourth edition of AMP Sound Branding's quarterly Sonic Branding magazine is now available to download. Take a deep dive into the financial sector, assessing thousands of hours of audio content across the industry using our patented Sonic Radar tool in combination with extensive desk research, which thankfully one of our members here of the AMP team will be getting into that in this conversation, as well as in AI evaluation, social media examination, and our annual Best Audio Brands Index. The team analyzed 55 traditional banks and 10 fintech companies on their Sonic performance. Today, we have a special guest joining the conversation to discuss all things Sonic in the banking and fintech sector. I'll let our guests introduce themselves and take over the mic. So, who wants to begin?
Ladies first.
Ladies first, please.
Well, thank you, gentlemen. That's very kind. Hi, everyone. My name is Liz Song. I'm the Global Category Development Officer for Spotify, and I get to work with all of our financial services and payments and banking and lending and insurance brands on their marketing objectives from an audio-first perspective. So really, my focus is helping them get the most out of their investment on Spotify. Michele, perhaps over to you.
Yes, thanks, Liz. I am Michele Arnese. I am the founder and the CEO of AMP, Sonic Branding. We do this every day. We do this for the most inspiring, iconic brands in the world, and some of them are part of this category today. That's why we want to start this conversation in the magazine and with you today live. I give to Bjorn also the chance to introduce himself before we dive into the conversation.
Yes, thank you, Michele. So my name is Bjorn Thorleifsson, and I'm head of strategy and research here at AMP. And I oversee all our deep dive into best audio brands and Amplify to make sure that we are getting some great insights in how brands are using sound.
Great, and I'm really excited to just dive deep into this conversation and just get straight into the questions. My first question is going to go towards Michele and Bjorn. Could you briefly explain to our live audience why you chose to focus on the banking and fintech sector for this edition of Amplify?
So as you know, we launch every single Amplify issue with one sector especially, and this one, I mean, we are not only doing sound for brands, we are very curious. And as a very curious about how brands are doing with sound, this is a category which for us is very, very interesting. If you look back at the evolution of banking and fintech, I mean, and I just throw some data already here, like in the US, the age where you have your first account is 17. So if you take this, and some years ago, the relationship to your bank was so long that it was in average longer than an average US marriage. I don't want to comment the data to compare, but I think this is something we have to think about. So you had basically a bank relationship, your lifelong, we can say. Now, look back in the last 2 years, 64% of Americans changed or adjusted their payment practices, services in the last 2 years. So it seems that loyalty, right? So what made banks very big in terms of families and people staying tied to the same bank brand, this is kind of over, at least for the majority of the American citizens. I think these data are very interesting. And we wanted, of course, when it comes to trust, loyalty, engagement, of course, sounds play a major role. That's why we decided, okay, let's have a look. What happens in the banking and fintech sector in terms of the use of sound, ideas around that, the touch points, and everything that belongs to this ecosystem. I don't know, Bjorn, if you want to add
also,
some.
I want to just add one point, and that is banks have been kind of catching up with the fintech companies with apps and so on. And sound there is such a crucial way of kind of informing the user whether payment has gone through or whatnot. And what we wanted to see is there a connection also between the UX, UI sounds and the sonic identity, or if the brands have even thought about having a sonic identity. So it's been a fascinating deep dive. You are muted, Barbara.
Excuse me. Love to hear all these data points and facts from the both of you, because this now takes me into my next question about the findings, and specifically the top 5 findings in this edition of Amplify, which really paint a picture of today's digital consumer. So sonic logo usage, human connection, and UX UI sounds are some of the points that we discussed in the magazine. So Michele, could you elaborate on what the findings tell us from a strategic perspective?
Yes, I don't want to give too much away. You can download the magazine, but I think there are some very interesting top findings. On one side, you have a brand that wants to establish a connection, as Bjorn said, across different touchpoints. On the other side, we found out after the analysis that the team did that 65% of the digital content in the entire sector is stock music. So potentially, all this content is the same for more than 100 brands. And I think this is a fact that tells us that the way the brands are approaching sound is still very like a commodity. We need music for the online content. Of course, we don't want silent content. We need something. We, of course, go to the stock music. Another top finding for us was very interesting. Normally, we didn't do that for other sectors. We had a look and we said, okay, how long, since when are banks working with sound? So, and we saw that 5 years ago, 15% of all banking and fintech brands launched a sonic logo, so a sonic mnemonic. 5 years ago, 15%. Then 4 years ago, 3 years ago, almost nothing. So it seemed to be 5 years ago that the banks thought, okay, we need a modern brand. We have a checklist. We have an identity, a visual identity. We have positioning. Okay, we need sound. Okay, check. They did it. Then 2 years ago and 1 year ago, basically this number of brands in the sector starting working with sound increased by far to 50%. So it seems to be a curve in terms that correlates with the age of audio. Of course, these brands see that the touch points where the customer get in touch with the brand and the contact points and everything, they are growing in terms of digital transformation for the brand. So they started thinking about sound again, but much bigger than 5 years ago. So the curve is like a U, but the last part is really high. And I think this was an interesting finding because we could analyze the entire sector according to this data. So on the other end, it seems to be also here, if we look at the amount of holistic sonic identities, so where you can recognize the brand not only in the last 3 seconds of a commercial, but when you can recognize the brand in different touch points. So the sonic logo offers only this kind of recognition. So it seems to be also in the amount of holistic sonic identities developed, which is very low still, that the recognition is the main topic, but the banks, they don't know better how to take this to something that works in different touch points. Am I talking about really a lot of touch points, including sponsoring, where Liz, of course, with Spotify and audio advertising and all these kind of things. So the limitation of the sonic logo is still there, although the number of brands that are developing a new sonic logo is increasing very, very fast. So that's why we see the potential of development in the future. And one last maybe data, only 7% of the traditional bank are part of this development. So are the younger brands and the fintech driving this development sometimes, and the traditional banks, they are coming also into this strategy as well. I think in general, this is what we observe. And if you also have a look, for example, at the functional sounds, what Bjorn said before, there is still a silence environment for banking. So if you use the sounds for payments, so you are in an open environment, you have a device who is silent, right? But there is no idea how to transport this precious engagement sound into different environments where you are not silent, and this has not been explored at all.
Yeah, and I think that's the great thing about having the potential to develop and improve this area for sonic identities. And now this leads me to my question to Bjorn: how does the banking sector compare to other industries in terms of sonic logo usage and owned music? And if fintech banks are growing in popularity, why do you believe they lack a sonic logo?
Well, what we are seeing when we compare these results to our best audio brands index is that actually banks are quite good at having a sonic logo. Saying that, they are not so good at incorporating it in all their material. I mean, they are very clear that they use it always in their advertisement. But what about in a YouTube video where they are, I don't know, talking about the newest hike in interest rates? Who knows? Like, then they are skipping using the sonic identity. It seems like they have gotten it kind of from the top, like, here's a sonic logo, please use it. But maybe they are lacking guidelines to how to implement and how to use it. And in terms of own music, what we are clearly seeing is that banks are not using it. There are a couple of good examples that are doing it, but in majority of cases, they are lacking it completely. And they feel like just having a sonic logo is enough. And as we have discussed already, is that it's a missed opportunity. And in terms of the fintech, I think N26 has their own music, and they use it consistently, but maybe due to the fact that they are young startups, they haven't maybe just the bandwidth right now to think about how else they can incorporate it. Because I am personally an N26 user, and I would love to have that sound that they are using in the advertisement within the app, so I can know, okay, I just sent 20 euros to my friend, it went through, he received it, or rather than him and me needing to text him and be like, did you receive it?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm also an N26 user myself, and I even, getting into this world of sonic branding, whenever I'm even checking out, I'm at the cash register and paying my groceries. It would be nice to have that payment sound to know that it went through, because I'm always looking at the vibration from my phone through the app. It's like these psychological things that I think we overlook on a daily basis. That would be nice to have.
Maybe one comment on this point, because as employer, I know we pay the salaries, and a lot of employees, they are with N26. Who are the target group? Are people who move from a country to another country, are business travelers, etc. Gen Z, young people. So I think even more, you should think about the potential of using sound to engage. And we know the fantastic contribution from leads from the report from Spotify in the magazine. Also, the young generations, and let's take Gen Z, for example, they expect that, and they are everywhere. So sound could be the home for their banking they don't have, basically. I think there is really a huge missed opportunity, having just the strategy applied to the target groups of the different bank and fintech in this case.
Great. No, great point there, Michele. I wanted to also add on to that point that you made earlier, Bjorn, but to ask you, in this edition of Amplify, you describe stock music as being used rather heavily across digital touchpoints by banks. Do you see stock music being substituted down the line with holistic sonic strategies? And is there room for improvement?
Well, I want my bank to be frugal. So I understand that they're not using big bucks to license music all the time. I'm all for it. But as we move further towards amazing AI music, for example, that can use a sonic DNA and a sonic identity as the building, like a blueprint, and that can then be incorporated into different styles, I think banks can utilize this new opportunity to, rather than relying on cheap stock music, they can have a sonic identity that then can be used to create fancy campaigns and build brand equity through that, but also in this kind of always on material like low involvement videos on YouTube, like we were talking about. Why not use the identity there that is created using AI, which then you're building brand equity, creating connections with the customers, while also saving money. And I can imagine banks will jump on that opportunity once they know about it. And that's why we're here. We're hopefully educating you guys who are watching.
Yeah, and also to those that are watching, feel free towards the end to ask us questions. We will make some time for our live audience. Now this leads me to asking you, Michele, a question about holistic sonic strategies. Banks can now target consumers on the go with the ubiquity, let's just say, of our smartphones via mobile apps. How can sonic branding move the needle for financial institutions using UX, UI, sounds, and design? Oh, Michele, you're muted.
Yeah.
Okay.
I would also add voice, for example, right? So in everything it is interaction with the brand. I think that what we learned in the last years is that sonic branding empowers the customer experience a lot. So at the end, you have the opportunity. Let's think about Skype. Many years ago. So I'm the oldest here. So I remember using Skype for the first time. The sounds that were used in Skype, they made the identity of Skype. Or let's take the ringtone from Nokia. This ringtone, it's a ringtone, but this made the sonic identity of Nokia at that time. So I think this is still true today, even more. So customer experiences create your engagement with the brands and create pieces of identity. So I think that we need to shift the needle, as you said, taking care of these customer experiences. For example, for banks, I agree that you don't want to hear the functional sounds in your app while you are in a bigger context. But maybe when you are going to the metaverse and you are doing things and you pay or whatever you do there, you might want to recognize that, okay, this is still my bank. It's a safe environment. I know what I'm doing and everything is working. Also with voice banking, right, at home. So I think there are a lot of new scenarios. That's why I think banks are at the very beginning of improving the customer experience through sound and voice. And there are some good examples, but these are like pilots in general. So there is, in terms of holistic view of sonic, there is a lot to do in this sector.
Yeah. Well, I come from a social media perspective, and now my question is going to be targeted towards you, Liz. When I was doing my research on this conversation, I kept coming into this word, which is personalization, and how much people really crave that in today's digital world. And it's almost like they expect this even from their banks, right? So why do you think audio became so ubiquitous within the last 2 years? As I think everyone knows, one of the most major life-stopping world events that happened with COVID. But what impact do you believe Spotify has had on digitally native Gen Zs and millennials, and how can brands take advantage of this personalized experience?
Definitely. Michele has already mentioned this idea that we're in a new age of audio. And I think part of that is digital audio. Digital audio has been the next evolution of how we as humans are consuming audio. And when you think about the way that we're consuming it, it's in a way that's unprecedentedly personalized. So we know that banks, neobanks, fintechs, right, whether you're a traditional brand or an up and coming startup, you want to achieve that level of personalization, especially with next gen audiences, with Gen Zs and with millennials. And when they're streaming music or a podcast, they're choosing the content. So we'll even think about your own experiences for those listening. If you are working out, you have a workout playlist. If you want to relax, perhaps you have a chill playlist. Or when you're choosing your podcasts, you're either looking to learn something new or to escape. Either way, there's intent, there's involvement. You're leaning in, you're choosing that content, it's active. That's what we call the sort of lean in experience. And if you compare that to other types of experiences where you're leaning back, for example, traditional radio, where you're just receiving content, or if you're just passively scrolling through feeds, that is where interactivity is lessened. And we know that interactivity increases engagement. So just the simple act of browsing for content makes that content more engaging, more memorable than consuming content that someone else has selected for you. And the reason why this is so important for Gen Zs and for millennials, it's because smartphones are kind of their everything, right? And Barbara, you asked, why did digital audio explode during the pandemic? And it's because despite loving their smartphones, they have major screen fatigue. During the pandemic, that was one of the reasons why we saw the growth of digital audio accelerate. And we continue to do research that confirms this finding. Screen fatigue is still around. So Culture Next is Spotify's annual research where we go out and we survey Gen Z and millennials around the world about audio, about culture. And to make these findings more relevant for financial brands, we actually identify the segment of respondents who are financial services intenders and purchasers. And what we have found that even now in 2022, 60% of those financial services purchasers who are Gen Zs and millennials, they say that they enjoy listening to audio more than they enjoy staring at a screen. 70% say that they stream music every day. That's more than those who stream video, who play online games, who watch live TV every day. So there definitely is that affinity for digital audio. And the reason why we attribute that to such heavy usage of digital audio is because Zs and millennials are using digital audio for self-discovery and self-expression. They tell us that they're using audio to explore all the different sides of their personalities, right? We hear from these next gen audiences that, they don't want to be pigeonholed into anything. They're unique snowflakes. And almost 70% of these Gen Z and millennial financial services purchasers use digital audio to understand themselves better. So it's incredibly personal. I mean, if you think about Wrapped is one of the most anticipated events of the year. This is when Spotify users get from us a recap of their most listened to songs and artists for the past 12 months. And for Zs and millennials, just even looking back on their listening habits, tell a story about who they are. You can't really get more personal than that. I say all of this because I really want financial brands to take away one thing, which is that they have to recognize the shifting nature of these next gen audiences. And a lot of that shifting, I really have to add, is happening on digital audio. It's either driven by their audio preferences or recorded by their actual behavior. So if their identities are not fixed, it means who they are today may not be who they are tomorrow. Right? So that's reflected by the genre of music, the track they're listening to, the podcast they're selecting. So for brands, you're no longer marketing to one person. You have to really think about marketing to almost a whole bunch of different people just to reach one single consumer. So I think the idea of micro moments becomes increasingly important for financial brands. For Gen Z and millennials, life stages won't go away completely, but financial brands really have to be more thoughtful about how they show up in daily life, much of which is accompanied by digital audio.
Everything you said was gold. Like, that was great. And I did read the Culture Next report from Spotify, and I really enjoyed it because a lot of the things that it touched upon was very relevant to the times, especially considering these cultural moments that you kind of have to be connected online to understand what is going on. There's another conversation that's happening online. The digital landscape is a place that now with Gen Z and millennials, it's like their second home. And a lot of the phenomenon that you discussed and also in the report from Spotify is outlining what's going on. So I definitely agree. It's to me something also even personal. And I also love the Wrapped. I love that. I always look forward to that at the end of every year. Yeah, it's so great. So my question now comes to Michele. When it comes to podcast advertising, because now podcasting is such a booming industry for some time now, but companies are investing by the billions. And so banks in this case are missing this element that is authenticity. What is the solution here? And are any banks grasping the perfect balance?
Authenticity is a big word. So I just can only basically continue what Liz said about lean in experiences, right? So I think that it's more about don't do the wrong thing with podcast advertising. So it's a context where you have to be able to catch the context audio wise. And if you do advertising in the wrong way, you have really the biggest disruptive experience for the people that you can have, because the podcast audience is very different from the classical advertising audience. It's like having someone who is screaming on the street. Okay, I watch him and that's okay. But if this goes to your home inside and starts to scream, this is where your space is. And I think that let's take the topic of podcast more in general. Banks and podcasts, what does it mean? Banks have also an educational role, right? So there is so much meaningful content through podcast, and you don't want to teach, right, at 20, 40 years old about the first house buy and the mortgage and having something ridiculous played in the podcast advertising at that moment. You can basically lose completely your professionality as a brand. You are lost. So I think that being flexible, and I come back to the point of authenticity, being flexible audio wise, I think this is key. You want to be recognized as a brand, okay, but you cannot go with the same sonic logo everywhere, in every topic, in every context. So being recognizable but flexible at the same time gives you the chance to be authentic. Let's think about a topic that banks talk about in podcast, and then you have an advertising in there. You can have, for example, a rendition of the music that recognizes your brand into this style that doesn't disrupt with the context you are in that moment. And this is a moment of truth. So podcast advertising is not advertising. This is a moment of truth because it's received in a very particular moment where you are listening content and leaning in. So I think that the authenticity we saw, I think, from the best audio brands, and Bjorn and the team did an update for Amplify. So we have kind of updated sector with the big research that we did. We have a number one bank that is using a holistic sonic identity, but is lacking a lot in authenticity. We measure that. And this is the problem, because if you are not authentic, you are not connecting with especially the next gens. And this is something, and these are people that care. It's not like the older generation, right? So they care about this connection. So you have to think about putting together, balancing the brand recognition, check, but the flexibility. We use always the James Bond example. And I think today or yesterday was the James Bond. So 60 years James Bond. So let's
that was great. Love it.
And I mean, this is a great example that we use to explain, James Bond lives and breath through 60 years with different generations, being flexible because it's not just a sonic logo or a jingle. So you have to think in the same way for brands, to take something that is flexible and adaptable in context, talking about lean-in experiences, podcast advertising, etc., and also in more general customer experience. You need this flexibility.
Yeah. Great answer there, Michele. Now I have a couple of questions that I'm going to head on to Liz. So you're now going to be on the hot seat. So Liz, from Spotify's Culture Next 2022 report in particular, you hint at the strong power of sound and how Gen Z and millennials use audio to define themselves. Is the consumer challenge correlated to this authenticity gap that banks seem to lack, and how can audio bridge this gap?
Yes. One of the key findings from Culture Next this year is that 70% of Gen Z and millennial financial services purchasers like it when the brands have a recognizable sound. And Michele has talked a little bit about that could be a sonic logo. For insurance companies, that might be a jingle or even the familiar sound of a celebrity spokesperson. And when you add on that 3 out of 4 expect their favorite brands to have a two-way conversation with them, I think those are some pretty loud calls to action for banks and neobanks and fintechs and lenders, right? So if they want to meaningfully engage Gen Z and millennials, they have to have a sound strategy. When Michele was speaking about flexibility, I was nodding along because I think that's so true. If sound is a new dimension of brand, then digital audio is an incredibly unique canvas for brand expression. So when we think about digital audio compared to some of the traditional brand assets, like let's think about a visual logo. It's pretty much a set font type, an image, or maybe some lockup of the two, and that's it. Like maybe once in a while you switch up the color for a different use case. Speaking of color, I come from a large global bank. My background is financial marketing, and I remember obsessing over brand color palettes. And those are purposefully architected for a reason, and therefore they have rules and they're limiting. But when you think about digital audio and how a brand can show up on digital audio from a brand perspective, let's just compare these traditional brand assets with a playlist. So the reason why I pick playlist is because Zs and millennials are creating their own playlists, they're sharing playlists, they're recommending playlists, right? So they're very much involved. It's what we call playlist culture. Music is so personal, right? So that's already a head start. So when you think about the majority of Zs and millennials, they actually enjoy it when their favorite brands curate their own playlists on streaming platforms. So that's just a consistent finding that we've had. This is our second year, I think, doing financial services analyses of our Culture Next research. And this is the consecutive finding year after year where we see playlist culture and the expectation for brands to have a distinct musical POV surfacing over and over again. So you have to think about digital audio being really a new place with new opportunities to make that authentic connection.
And also the question leads, why can you cannot be inspired by a bank? Why? Who says that, right? So I think this is the moment of connection and engagement that you have. So there is nothing in a sector that says you don't engage with music with your consumer. This is completely wrong in terms of ignoring great possibilities. So why not?
And I think financial brands are becoming increasingly open to this, right? I think brand safety has been something, brand integrity, these are all open questions, but like we get to work with some of the world's biggest brands, financial brands, the world's biggest banks and, startups as well. And I think we're seeing a lot of willingness to experiment and to innovate for that very reason.
Yeah. Great points there made, Liz. We do have now 4 more questions left before we dive into the Q&A section of the live stream. So Liz, how do you see advertising within podcasts shifting in the future? Also, how might financial institutions pioneer this space?
I mean, Michele has already talked about the special relationship between big banks and podcasts. I think podcasts is a really interesting space for financial providers. A lot of the banks, they've created their own proprietary podcasts. They have their in-house researchers and economists and advisors. These are the experts who are writing those 30-page, 50-page white papers, and now they're recording podcasts, right? It's just the latest in their content stack. So we know that financial providers are podcast believers, and we're starting to see that they're also podcast advertisers. And that's because podcast listeners, we know that they tend to be younger, they're more educated, they're more multicultural, they have a little bit more money. It's a desirable audience, right? So we really work across the board, whether it's the traditional banks or startups around the world, from everything from those standard 30-second podcast ads to full-on content sponsorships to, custom activations. Because for podcast advertising, that relationship between the listener and their favorite show host, that's special. We often talk about it as having a trusted friend, right? So being present in a podcast creates a little bit of a halo effect for financial brands. It just lends them a little bit more of that authenticity that's typically elusive. It's one of the reasons we do a lot of host-read ads for financial brands. They're really popular, right? They're effective. They deliver more emotional connectivity as measured by things like familiarity and affinity. But I think what's important to remember, though, despite all of this great alignment, is that podcasts are still a relatively new format. And the technology has pretty much stayed the same since the 2000s. And Spotify is really trying to change that. In 2020, we launched streaming ad insertion. This was a game changer. For the first time, we were able to confirm ad impressions. It sounds a little insane, but prior to what we call SAI, streaming ad insertion, you didn't really know if a podcast ad that you paid for was actually heard. And we've continued to add to that offering. We have call to action cards now, which are basically clickable podcast ads. One of the things that we did last year was roll out the Spotify Audience Network. This made audience-based buying across our network of podcasts available at a time when most podcasts were being bought and sold on a title by title basis. Like, that doesn't really scale, right? And so if you think about the Spotify Audience Network, it's really lowering the barrier to entry, and you don't have to be a podcast expert in order to advertise. Did you ask me to make a prediction? I'm sorry, I'm just talking. Sorry, remind me, was there another angle to this question?
No, I just really wanted to understand the financial institutions, like their power in this space and pioneering, and just kind of like what you see advertising in the future.
Okay, so I'll take a guess, right? And you try not to hold me to it, but one of the other key findings that we surfaced in this year's Culture Next is that 2 out of 3 Gen Z and millennial financial services purchasers said they would like to be able to select the ad they get when listening to an audio streaming service.
That'd be nice.
So just think about that for a second, right? And financial brands really should take some time to imagine a day when they're not in the driver's seat. Because right now, right, providers, they identify their priority audiences. They set the targeting. They give it over to Spotify. We make sure their ads reach those people. But if we insert audience control into that mix, brands are going to have to work a little bit harder to increase the chance that their ad is selected. But the payoff would be huge, right? They're going to enjoy greater awareness and intent even before the digital audio ad plays.
That would be great.
And you can measure that, right, Liz? So basically, and this comes on top. I think that's why commenting what you just said, that people are able to choose their advertisement. This sounds really crazy, but at the end, the content will engage the people.
That's right.
So, and 50% of this content normally is audio. In this case, is just 100%. So I think being able to analyze the audio content, for example, like we do with Sonic Radar for all brands, just to understand which tonality are we communicating or which music are we using, the voice, how about the voice, etc. This gives the key to understand the measurements that you can do, and to understand why this engages more than this, and how it's performing this, and why do people select more this brand. So I think that there is really, like, we close the circle in understanding how produce a purposeful communication from the brand perspective that can be then executed in advertising in streaming platforms. And I mean, the podcast is very important, because as you said, it's a kind of young format, but developing very fast. And you see now YouTube is doing podcasts. Everybody is doing podcasting. That's why I think for the financial sector,
no one as good as Spotify, though, right, Michele? You gotta remember that.
I remember that. That's why my conclusion was, that's why I think for the sector would be even more important to have a platform that has been accepted as one of the pioneers and the first platforms because the platform transmits the message as well, not only the brand. And I think this is a really important point for banking brands to have the trusted connection, to keep this authority in a good sense, right? So it's it's proven content. It's on Spotify, like, the podcast and the educational part.
Maybe one thing that I would like to add related to Liz was saying about being able to choose your ad. So what we found is that the mood that the banking sector is using in majority is ethereal, calm, and sad. Well, in the sad, not necessarily depressing, but minor keys and slow pace and so on. And banks, it's a very important topic, but maybe not most fun for everyone. But if people will be able to choose their commercials, it will be important that these banks shift from using just this ethereal, calm, and sad music to uplifting, but still trustworthy. So if banks start to consciously think about what kind of music and not just doing what they've been always doing, they can actually make sure that the advertisement is engaging and fun and not a downer.
Bjorn, I would also make the argument, because of the flexibility point that Michele made earlier, if we're going to get smarter about context, maybe you would serve up a sad financial services ad if your target user has been listening to breakup songs for the last week, because that is a way for a financial brand to show sympathy, to show alignment, and also, more importantly, to show recognition that I know you, right? As opposed to, I'm going to serve you up something upbeat and dancey, even though you're probably moping around the house and eating ice cream.
Yes, absolutely. Right? And then we go back to frugality and the option of having AI music.
Yeah.
Because then you can have loads of options that are all with the sonic identity, but will change depending on what playlist you're listening to or whatever you're listening to. So there's great options and possibilities for banks to engage really personally to consumers.
And it comes back down to that, that element of personalization that people just crave. And I guess also to Liz's point, to feel seen and understood. I think it's really important to note that. Now, Liz, when we were, working on Amplify, we spoke with well-established employees at bank marketing agencies about financial institutions' expansion into the metaverse and the role sound will play in this endeavor. How do you see banks leveraging sound in this new immersive reality? And how will Spotify approach this digital touch point from the already impactful audio-only advertising on the audio streaming platform?
Yeah, I think it's an exciting space. We're definitely seeing financial brands, in Decentraland, on Roblox. They're doing a whole bunch of different activations, whether it is music related or not, right? And I think it's just still very early days. At Spotify, we believe in ubiquity as well. We want to immerse our users in an audio world wherever they're listening, however they're listening. So we're proud to be the first digital audio platform that entered the metaverse when we launched Spotify Island in Roblox earlier this year. It's where we want to bring these unique experiences to fans and to artists alike. People can go into Spotify Island to meet up. They can create sounds and make music. They can hang out. They can get virtual merchandise. And I think we have a lot more to do. I mean, we've already added K-Park and I think most recently Planet Hip Hop, which, so K-pop and hip hop. Wow, try saying that really quick. I just went K-pop and hip hop. These are the two top genres on Spotify. And for us, the exercise in the metaverse is really just about engaging Gen Zs in this kind of emerging world and building brand love. So I think a lot more to watch out for.
Yes, and I think this is exactly something we experiment right now a lot with a lot of brands. But we are also measuring. We are also seeing what happens there. What is working? What is not working? We did with Mastercard launched the first Sonic identity in the Metaverse in the Pride Month, where people were dancing on the virtual plaza, together. And this is a manifestation of the brand in a new space. So there is an interesting point between having a seamless transition to the metaverse as a space, so as seamless as it can, but on the other hand, having also a specialized experience there that should be different. You don't build brick and mortar in the metaverse, such some brands did. You don't want to have a traditional store in the metaverse. You are in a different space. So I think there is an interesting exploration of the balance between seamless and between dedicated to the platform in terms of sound.
Now, my last question to you, Liz, before we end it with Michele and Bjorn. As banks and fintechs continue to evolve rapidly with the times, what do you think we'll see more of from brands?
I think we're going to see more sophisticated use of data. Financial brands are always looking to deepen their audience understandings. And at Spotify, we have such a wealth of our own first-party data to mine. And that's because we have scale, we have a 100% logged in audience, so we know who everyone is. And we're trying to deploy all of that data for insights that are industry specific, right? We want to give our financial brands the tools for them to make smarter, faster, better decisions. So I'll give you an example of an analysis that we've done recently. We identified the preferences and habits specific to financial services listeners on Spotify. So how did we do this? First, we identified the podcast shows that touch on investing, the economy, finance. And then we said, okay, well, if these are financial shows, then the people who listen to these shows are financial services listeners. And because we have their user IDs, we're able to understand what other podcasts they're listening to, not just financial, so endemic and non-endemic, because even money-minded listeners are not always in a money moment, right? They're real people with other interests. And so we could kind of understand their podcast listening behaviors. And for the first time ever, we followed these financial services listeners over to the music side. And then we were able to understand, okay, well, what artists are they listening to? What music genres? And this allowed us to really build this 360-degree profile, if you will, of a financial services listener on Spotify. And that's incredibly powerful, I think, to help reduce some of the guesswork that financial brands have around a sonic strategy. We can help them be a little bit more informed through data around targeting, around messaging, around creative. So it's just one of the ways that we're trying to help them as we figure out what does it mean, not only to have a sonic brand, but also to have it come to life.
Great answer, Liz. On all those points, I definitely can tell you that is very important to know as the digital times evolve with us, and let's see how that even looks like, right? Because it's at times unpredictable and that's sometimes in our control as both creators and consumers in this world. So to close it off, Michele and Bjorn, it sounds like sonic strategy is the key to targeting the next gen consumers and establishing overall memorability. What is the first step banks or fintech companies, or to those who are watching that are working in this industry, might want to do to kickstart their journey to holistic sonic identities?
So let's do it alphabetically. Bjorn, you first.
Well, aside from talking to us, they can start thinking about creating just guidelines about how to use their sound that they already have. Or if they don't have an identity, you can still think about what kind of stock music you're using, or what genres you're using. Like, does it fit your profile? And another thing is, I would be careful of thinking about having a sonic identity and sonic strategy as a PR event, because there have been some notable examples of banks in recent years where there's a big fanfare, they got a big artist who created 5 tracks, and what do we have then? We have a bank that did this whole big coming out, we have a sonic identity, but then they don't use it because, again, like Michele was talking about, the flexibility was lacking. No 5 tracks are going to be able to convey all the different emotions and storytelling that a bank needs to talk about. So great, you have 5 tracks, but what are you going to do with them? So what we are seeing with this particular brand that I'm not going to name and shame is that they are mainly just using the Sonic logo that was created, and maybe in less than 20% of the video material that they create, they're actually using one of those 5 tracks. So think about longevity of your identity rather than the PR announcement that you can create out of it.
Yeah, I think to this point, it's on us to educate how to start. We receive a lot the question from brands. This sounds everything fantastic, but how can we start? What are the first steps into this? So I think we need to help, especially like banking and fintech brands, to develop this idea of authenticity and flexibility, because this is what a bank is about, and this is lost through the change in the loyalty behavior and these kind of things. So to me, would be connect. I think that the key for a successful brand, a Sonic brand, and I connect also leads in this discussion, right? You connect the brand with your consumers with sound in different stages. You need to take care of all of these stages as a brand. And I think the flexibility is key for that, but understanding how does your brand sound and does not sound. So these 2 questions are the first starting point of this journey. To be yourself, to be authentic to the people. And this is what you want to be as a bank. So I think there is a lot to do in this sector, but it's fascinating because there is an ever-evolving way to interact with banks that changed a lot in the last couple of years. So we are looking to the next steps and the future of the customer experience working in this sector.
So we already have some comments that I would love to pull up. Before I show them on the screen, I wanted, if it's okay with Bjorn, to share your contact information if anybody has any questions further on Amplify. Is that okay? I have the banner set up.
Of course.
Okay, so there you have it. That's the contact information to get in touch with Bjorn if you have any questions on Amplify, and our team would be more than happy to answer them.
And of course, if you are in the industry and you don't see your bank within the ranking, we would be more than happy to have a conversation and actually look into how your bank sounds and how we can maybe improve it.
Great to hear that. So I just want to pull up some comments on everyone. If you're still watching towards this point of the live stream, submit your questions now. Liz, we have a lot of love from your Spotify team. I just do want to pull up this one comment that was really sweet from Penny Schwartz. Liz Song, I could listen to you all day long. I learned something new about our industry every single time.
Thanks, Penny.
And from Samuel Vermont, 100% Elizabeth. Super interesting to hear the fin-centric insights from Culture Next and how it applies to the industry trends. So we have a lot of love. So as we wait for some of the questions to come in, any last thoughts from our panel here today? Oh, Bjorn. Yeah.
Sorry, I'm just curious, and this is a question towards Liz. So when you have host-read podcast ads, and often you, before advertisement starts, it's usually with a little sound identity from the company that is producing it.
Okay. Mm-hmm. So you're talking about podcast, the actual show music.
Yeah, or like Acast has a a little identity that comes before the Acast commercial. So my question is there a possibility for brands to merge the two things, as in to have the podcast red ad and then end it with a Sonic logo? And if so, why are so few brands doing it?
Yeah, so I think it's interesting. So I think, Bjorn, just to level set a little bit for those on the call. So in a podcast, there are usually 3 different spots where ads are inserted, what we call the pre-roll, which is at the beginning of the show, somewhere in the middle of the podcast, the mid-roll, and then at the end. And so I think the question is about, well, how do brands kind of almost like tag on when they first appear, when the show starts, the idea of a sonic element. So the advertiser has a little bit more audio presence. That's certainly possible. We have ads where our brands, financial brands, are including their sonic logos in different spots. It's usually at the end of their ad. But if they wanted to include it at the beginning, that's certainly something that they have the option to do. And I think some of the one of the top questions we get, especially for newer advertisers, is that choice between a host read ad versus voice talent. And I think this is similar to the conversation that you guys have a lot around stock music versus kind of like original music, right? There's that idea of, well, it's stock, it's voice talent, but our research has found that there's a time and place for everything. For voice talent, that is still really effective, especially like for the shorter ads, the 30-second ads. And that's great for scale, right? That's great for campaigns that are going to be running a little bit longer. But the host read ads are better when you have a longer format, when you want to do something that's a little bit more top of funnel. So again, it really depends on what the brand's objectives are. But to that flexibility point, digital audio allows them to experiment and to innovate and optimize.
Thank you. That's really insightful.
Basically, you have a time and place for everything. We just need to know and to have the insights that guide you as a brand.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So now that we're closing up, thank you so much, Liz, for your time. I did want to just say, when it comes to just in-host read podcasting ads, there was this one in particular that I won't name the podcast. Maybe you know about it because it became viral. And the host had no idea what ad he was reading. It was like promoting like this berry company. Hilarious. Like to this point that I still have it in my brain because I was like crying out of laughter on how this was even an ad that he, I guess, wasn't aware of. But they kept.
That blows my mind too, right? I mean, part of that connection between brands and podcast show hosts is sort of that alignment, right? There needs to be that authenticity, and in that example, I mean, there's not even a lack of authenticity. There's just a lack of connection, right? So for us, it's really important that we work with our partners on what they're trying to achieve, what's the audience are trying to go after. And we're very thoughtful about the shows that we recommend. And, for our Spotify original exclusive content, we work very closely with show hosts to also ensure that they feel like the financial brands are in line with their own personal brand and what their show stands for, because they have to protect their relationship with their listeners. So it really goes two ways. It should, at least, for it to work out for everyone.
Totally agree. Well, thank you so much, Liz. Thank you to everyone here, my AMP team, for joining this live conversation. We've come to the end of this live stream, but for anyone that wants to continue on, just sharing this conversation, the highlights of it all, it will be saved on AMP's LinkedIn Live company page. So feel free to check it out there. It will also be all across our social channels if you also want to, rewatch this again. And other than that, we've had a really insightful conversation.
I want to thank personally Liz for the contribution today, but also for the precious guest comments in the magazine. So you will see it when you download the magazine. I think it's really, really interesting to get this collaboration kicked off. And this could be really a very interesting starting point talking about the next audio revolution. I want to thank also Carla Calandra from Wunderman Thompson, New York, for the contribution together with Christoph Ramler from Unicredit Milan in the magazine, talking about banking in the metaverse. I think it's a really rich publication that is there to be downloaded, and I think this is just the starting point of this conversation. So thanks again, and thank you, Liz, for taking part in this one.
No, thank you. I think this has been so exciting. I've loved learning from you all during the process. So great to have been here.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.